Hello, everyone. I'm Michaela Parker. I'm founder and executive director for the Academic Data Science Alliance, and I'm here to welcome you to our monthly Listen and Lunch AI speaker series, where we invite experts around the academic landscape to tell us about how they are incorporating AI technologies on their campuses, what approaches they're taking, what policies they're enacting. Today, we are delighted to welcome our guest, Michael Colaresi. He will be telling us about navigating trade-offs in generative AI policy and shared governance on campuses. Before we get started, though, I want to draw your attention to the QR code on this slide that will take you to our code of conduct. That code of conduct governs all of our events, including these online webinars. You can also find a link to that code of conduct at footer of our website. For those of you who are not familiar with the Academic Data Science Alliance, or ADSA, we are a community of data science leaders, practitioners, and educators who believe in a just, equitable future where data science approaches are thoughtfully applied in all domains for the benefit of all. I mentioned our website. There's a URL at the bottom of this slide and also a QR code that will take you there so you can learn more about our events, activities, and member of ADSA. So, as I said, today we're welcoming Michael Colaresi, who is Associate Vice Provost for Data Science at the University of Pittsburgh, where he leads the Responsible Data Science Initiative. He is also the William S. Dietrich II Professor of Political Science and leads the Responsible Data Science Complexity and AI for Peace Lab. His research group measures human rights violations from large-scale text databases, forecasts political violence in high spatial and temporal resolution, and works on understanding the role of emergent communication and computation technologies from AI to AdTech in democratic and autocratic political systems. So, Michael, welcome to our webinar, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real treat to be here.
So we're just going to go and jump right in. Many college and university campuses are actively integrating generative AI tools in teaching, learning, research, and administration. Some have even created their own tools, while others are considering investing in them. Can you give us a sense of what are some important trade-offs that campus leaders should consider when implementing generative AI technologies on campus, and maybe provide an example of how these trade-offs might manifest, such as balancing academic freedom with institutional oversight?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a great question. It's something we're all absolutely going through, but maybe I'll preface all my comments with saying, like, you introduced me as an expert. Like, I don't feel like an expert in this area. Like, I am an interested party. And what I'll share is my attempt to surf above the surface, right, in this like AI and data science space instead of be submerged in it, which is sort of how I think about our navigation, of the issues that you're talking about. I'll also maybe preface by saying, like, I'm relatively hopeful and optimistic about like what's possible like in this space. And much of that comes from my belief in what data science can bring to the table. But to your specific question, I mean, I really think that the trade-offs, it's dangerous to think about overall abstract trade-offs. I think we need to ground the discussion, right, in specific uses, intentions, and goals. So I would organize those for a university around sort of three parts of our mission. And I really do think there are different sets of sort of trade-offs, as well as ways we can try to sort of transcend narrow trade-offs on each of them. So if we're talking about student success, I think the trade-offs are quite clearly like, how do we allow students to learn responsible uses of quickly changing agile technologies, right, that have really sort of novel intersection with the knowledge economy. And I think that's something that like we have to grapple with. And the trade-off is it's a lot easier, I think, to do what we've been doing and just teach what we know how to do in specific ways. But I do think that leaves students behind. And so the challenge in this case, I think, is what are responsible uses? And the trade-off in some senses, we have to, I think, like start using tools that we have less control over. I mean, so I know when I teach scientific computation to social scientists, for example, I literally control almost every part of the pipeline of what students are doing. I have complete control over the code I want them to run, right? I even might have like the cluster, right? And be working with people on the hardware side of exactly what that cluster configuration is. And when we're talking about generative AI technologies, most of them, right, will be running somewhere else. And you won't exactly know like what's happening. And I would say that that's a trade-off worth taking in the student space, and teaching people like how to learn from, these experiences and even the mistakes they would make, right? I think is really, really important that they're going to use them. And I mean, I think uh, the surveys are a lot of people are using these tools and not telling people, other than anonymous survey takers, like about these things. And I would much rather us do this together and walk through best practices as opposed to everyone sort of be atomized, picked off, and doing things potentially wrong and not talking about it, and even more embarrassed, and it's harder to learn sort of the best rules. So for student success, I think we have to relax a little bit about control right over the classroom environment and learn and see and meet people kind of where they are. If we're talking about innovation and research breakthroughs in particular, I mean, I think absolutely the trade-offs between sort of intellectual property, privacy, replicability, explainability, right? Like all are there, right? Balanced against like we all are competitive. We want the fastest time to science that we can get. We need new drug discoveries. We need to understand, how things work in this complex world, and any tool that can help us do that is valuable. Um, I think in this case, what we really need is university-wide discussions that include multiple units. Like we can't just look at this as a computing problem. We need to look at this as what I would say is a applied data science problem, that we're trying to solve problems with data and models to the best of our ability. I'm not saying that GenAI doesn't have some new aspects of how we use it. I'm not saying it's just like pandas or like some library. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying we do have the know-how to have leadership, right, over how to design research to do what we want to do. And we need to kind of take ourselves out of a computational loop, and be in control, right, in this respect. We need to demand to know the trade-offs and be able to check and verify what companies are doing with what data, or we need to build our own tools and build the capacity to be able to do that. Um, I think the model here is one of collaboration, between universities and companies, that's when we could do the most potentially together, but that depends on the details of the problem and who's willing to do what. Without that, there are starker trade-offs, right, of what a university can build themselves, right, even with a smaller scale partner, let's say, versus larger generative AI companies in particular. And then if we're talking about operations within the university, I think we really have to worry about dependency, and we have to worry about what the core value added of a university is, that you're not giving away like what you're good at, and becoming dependent on something that then takes away like what you can give to your region, and what you can give to your particular students and your community. So that means investing in trust. That means thinking about privacy from multiple different stakeholders. That means students have to be at the table. That means staff have to be at the table. Faculty have to be at the table. And we need to think about the real use cases in the real world and what sort of good and harm, can come from the use of these systems, how they're changing, and like what we're doing on campus. And I think privacy is a really big deal, in that regard. I'm happy to go back to. You asked for examples, like in particular, I think. Is there anyone you want to like, is there one of those three sort of university missions you'd want to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, examples for all of them would be great. But the one that kind of stood out to me initially, and I apologize, I think my internet keeps going in and out, so hopefully I don't freeze, is around, so the very first point about student success, right? You talked a lot about teaching and responsible use, but I heard something maybe a little concerning. Disturbing might be too harsh. 6 months or a year ago, when generative AI was first coming on the scene, where administrators are considering using some of these technologies to really track students. And when we talk about student success, it's under the auspices of, well, we want all students to succeed, so we need to know who's doing their homework or who they're talking to. And I just wonder if you have any comments about what level of student privacy do you weigh with supporting students in their journey through academia using these
Yeah.
technologies?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It intersects with something that, like, I think actually complicates the discussion too, which is the agility we need to do this well, right? That as technologies and the tools are changing, like we actually need to keep up, like with that and what we're teaching. And personally, I think we can use some software development tools and other things to do that well, and we're trying to do that here at the University of Pittsburgh. But it absolutely, like those solutions actually can compound the privacy concerns, because it's really about sort of tracking who does what and trying to be efficient. But you then have to have that information somewhere, to know who's seen what and who needs updating and all these things. So I'm a social scientist, right? So I come back to like this is about people. And I'm actually not comfortable saying, well, we shouldn't do any of these things, right? Because there might be problems with it. Like I'm a really big believer in having discussions that involve stakeholders about what they're comfortable with, what they're not, and why, right? And how we can get over that. But it doesn't mean like taking for granted that because someone signs a release and checks a box that they didn't read, that we can have everything and anything that we want, right? Like from their interactions, particularly like, um, I I don't think anyone wants to live in fear of a newspaper article that figures out like what you're doing. And so, I'm actually very proud. I think the University of Pittsburgh has been really good about these discussions and including different voices. Everyone can be better because everything's changing and we're never like, doing it like perfectly. But I know there's been a lot of will to figure out like what's going on, communicate that to people, and then learn what they're comfortable with and what they're not. And that's both in person, that's in surveys, right? That's, in every way like we can. And I would say it's also like not just traditional students, like we're engaging with the workforce, of today and non-traditional students. We need to know what they're comfortable with, right, too, on this. And we can't think about sort of one size fits all, in this area. So I really think transparency is huge. I think there's actually some huge benefits to this. Like, I mean, I know my students, they don't actually understand how the internet works, right? So like Web 2.0 is a mystery to people. Like I like making fun of like things in class. Like most of what we know about like the online world is a myth, right? Like the browser. Like actually you're being browsed, right? Like you're not on a Safari, right? Like it's like you're actually the animal, like, being watched. Explorer, come on, right? Like all of these things. Like literally cookies are like on your computer and they're not sweet. Like all of these things like are the language, in many ways clouds the reality of the flows of information that are out there. So this is an opportunity actually to talk to people about how all of this works. And I don't think you can have a discussion about what people are comfortable with if they don't understand. And there's some complexity here that we need to explain. And I don't know where else but a university, that has a sort of a mission to do that and like have those conversations both in class and outside. So I know that's not a very clean answer that has a, Roman numeral 1A, like 1, 2. And I also think different communities might have different tolerances, right, for these things. Um, and it's part of possibly what we need to be a little more comfortable with is a little less control, right, over how it works everywhere and a little more sort of polycentric governance, but an understanding of why it works that way, right, in these like local institutional ecosystems that we have.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good lead into my next question, which especially going back to that idea of student privacy and tools and companies that might be using that data, or like you were just saying, we're not on a safari, we're being watched.
Mhm.
So when it comes to campuses and making decisions about generative AI technologies, and overseeing that implementation and use on campus. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of creating those thoughtful shared governance structures? So, like, maybe start with what is shared governance, why it's important, and who should be at the table in these conversations.
Yeah. So I think universities in many cases, and the University of Pittsburgh, I think, is a good example of this. We're at a crossroads. There's unionization some places, right? Some places have like very old and very functional faculty senate models, as well as including like staff where student governance like is connected and involved, and others it's not like that. And so there's a sort of both heterogeneity, but also an evolution and change, like in this space, like across universities. So I'm I'm very cognizant that my experience won't be what everyone's like experience is, but I will talk about a little bit what I think we've like done well and what we're trying to do better, in the shared governance space. So number one, I think like don't be embarrassed to say like as an administrator, you don't know, right? And then reach out for people to help you. So I know people generally think that like sort of ad hoc committees are band-aids, but they can be a bridge to something more permanent, and they can build, and particularly if you're drawing on different parts of the university that aren't talking to each other, like in this space, they can really help build a community that tells you who else needs to be at the table. So even identifying the stakeholders in this space, like generative AI, like, is kind of everywhere. In really important ways. We can't talk to everyone all at once, right? That's impossible in having a discussion about this, but we need to start having discussions that that resonate with different parts of campus, that there are ways that people can get in touch with decision makers when they're unhappy or confused. And maybe I'll answer this question a little bit by like what I just want to avoid at like all costs. And that's really a disconnection between individual faculty, staff, and students. And let's just say, like for them, like them being disconnected from each other and the resources of the university. I mean, I think the number one word I hear about generative AI, it's not excitement, it's anxiety. It's really people being like scared and afraid at what the world looks like as these changes are happening. And it shouldn't be like that. Like, I mean, we need to react in, I think, both institutional, technological ways to get ahead of this for people. And number one, that means being for them. So they're not alone in their office, in their carrel, in the library, like wherever, feeling like it's their problem to manage and deal with. It's a billion, trillion, I don't know, big number, right? Industry versus them. And we have no chance, right, of sort of manifesting our value, right, in that kind of interaction. But as we start networking together, as we have the resources of the university that we understand how to use and stop looking at it as like just me and my screen, right? That I have to verify everything. I have to figure out what the responsible use is. But instead we say that, well, there's this interaction and I'm doing things. What I do is important, like on my screen and my keyboard, but I have a whole network of people that when I have questions, like they have my back, right? When they don't know, they know somewhere else to go to. Like these are bridging institutions that in some ways are challenging for universities that have been siloed in disciplines. We absolutely need these cross-disciplinary bridges so everybody can talk to and has friends, that are a computer scientist, but you need to know people in like nursing maybe too if health things come up. I mean, we need to have these networks that can be very flexible and they're non-traditional. The one place they are traditional is data science. And so I will flag that what I have found incredibly important and exciting, right, is when you realize the data science community already has a lot of these connections, that the polycentricity, right, of the applications and the uses, right, are a wonderful case about how to not feel alone, right, and how to keep up with technology that's changing like really quickly. But you're doing that as a community. And I've been inspired by that. ADSA has been a huge part of showing me that that's like been possible. It also leads me to think that like data science is one of the answers of how to get ahead of this for universities, that we have to stop seeing sort of AI and generative AI as being something separate from like data science. Instead, we have to start seeing it as part of data science, that the humans, it's digital leadership, not just competency in the tools. It's agency, right, over these things. Research design, maybe even more important now than it's ever been. It's always been a data science strength. And then we absolutely like need to lean on that. Communication, critical thinking, right? Like with hybrid technologies, talking to people and machines, all about it. But I think that's the answer. But we need to network the people together. I mean, I think that's my like answer like to your use case. The other part is like I don't want an administration, right, that's disconnected from what's happening and actually going on in the classroom, in the library carrels and dorms, like in staff offices and what's happening on the ground. I think that's just as bad, right? Having like one central message that's like very well organized and seems coherent and cogent abstractly, but doesn't actually touch the ground and deal with the needs, right, of individuals and the use cases in the university. I think that's just as big of a disaster as people also feeling alone. So we need each other. And so shared governance, I think, is the reality of bringing together staff, students, absolutely, and administrators. And I would add one more component that I found really helpful in what we've done, which is we need to include the community and companies, right, in doing this. And that we need to stop thinking so disciplines as silos, but we need to get rid of this idea of universities as silos too. We need to learn from companies about what their use cases are, both for students and for operations and for research, that it helps across this mission. So I would say like these are stakeholders also that we want in a shared governance model. So if you don't have an external advisory board, get one. And ask them questions about how they're using these things. How do they govern? How do they think about this? And then when they don't know, you can problem solve and talk together. They're now part of your network. And they have sort of different capabilities than you do to help.
I love that. It's all about community. Yeah, that's great. So I just to step back because you covered a lot there, and I'm just thinking of those campus leaders or those campuses where they haven't taken that first step yet in developing a shared governance structure. What would you recommend if you had like one piece of advice, just how to get started? Is it those ad hoc committees, or what was a good place to start?
Yeah. So, in a self-serving way, I would say if you have a data science organization on your university that you're already investing in, particularly one that I would say is broadly engaged in the university community. So not just engineering and computer science. They're generally already networked together. So there's nothing like necessarily unique about a data science institute that's just that. But a data science institute, initiative, academy, whatever you call it, that's already connected across campus and units to use cases is something that you can leverage. These are people that are already connecting technology and people. And so I would really urge people to talk to the leaders, right, of that group, what's worked and what hasn't. They're probably struggling with some of the same things, but they have experience dealing with this agility of technological development and this sort of intersection, of use cases and abstraction, things that sort of creep everywhere, but in some sense are nowhere. And there's a language about like how to talk about that. And responsible uses, I think, do translate to some extent to some of these newer technologies and how to verify and how to think about. So I would say one, if you don't have that, just make an ad hoc committee, right? Because that'll get you up and running quickly. And then what you need to make sure is that it's representative across the university, right? This is not just a technological problem. This is about use cases across the mission of the university. And I would also urge people to think both about sort of like different themes, like if they would. So, if you think about your different schools, that's fine. But then you also got to think even within those, you got to have people that are focused on teaching, right? Like involved. If everybody across the whole university is just research, you're still missing a big part of the mission, right? And then you have to include operations, right? Like into this in the core. And the more we segregate out, different parts of the mission, the less we're going to learn, I think, about like what works and what doesn't, and like how to incorporate best practices. Subcommittees are fine, right? I'm all about like hierarchy and structure, but I do think we need to network people together. And then hopefully that ad hoc committee can lead to something or several things, right, that are more permanent.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And plus a million to your data science institute. And I swear, as a professional association for data science, I did not plant that answer. So I am mindful of time. If you have a question, please put it in the chat or just say I have a question because I don't want to cut us off before I do get a chance to get to the audience. But I have another question if we don't see a hand raise or a drop in the chat. So I will go to that now, but if we see something, we'll pivot. So my next question is about keeping things relevant, and these technologies just evolve and adapt, and they're coming out with new capabilities all the time. So how do institutions, once they have these AI policies in place, make sure they remain relevant and adaptable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll just talk about it from a visibility standpoint, but if you want to talk about specific curriculum, which I think actually is among the hardest things to solve for a university, like in this space, like I'm happy to talk about that as a follow-up. I would say here for me, our external advisory board is absolutely crucial. So I can tell you, like, yes, I read the MIT Tech Review, like the algorithm for Medium, like has me down as being interested in this stuff, right? And so I like surf and read 75, right? Like posts, like on this, like every week at least. But I would say the most valuable tips I get, like on what's out there, are from people from our advisory board who will email and say, like, have you seen this? Or like, and sometimes I have, but often I haven't, right? And we look it up and we say, what do you think? And then we have a conversation about it. And that's a very like deep discussion. There's some trust, right, involved there where they're flagging something that they think is important. Sometimes there's a vulnerability where they're like saying, I don't understand, I don't know, can you help me? And that's why I think having a board and not just sort of cold calling people, like meeting regularly and having relationships, asking what they need, is really, really crucial. But I think that's sort of the number one. I don't know that I think of it as innovative because in the social sciences, we didn't do this very well. Like we didn't connect, right, to like industries and their changing needs, very, very quickly. I think in data science, we do like much better because we've had to, but there's a whole different cadence and pace, like right now to this that takes a sort of deeper discussion, but it has to move quickly, in this. So I would say it's the advisory board, it's the people, it's the network, it's the university, like not being an ivory tower, right? But instead be like absolutely located in your region and neighborhood, like and connected to alumni, like connected to people, that like value your institution and what you can bring. That's I think that's the best case scenario. I would say there's one other place that does this really well for me, which is we have a Center for Research Computing and Data, right? And so while the use cases are everywhere, right, often what we're talking about are new technologies, right, that then filter down to use cases like for everyone. And the people at our Center for Research Computing and Data, the CRCD, they're on this, right? They're like tuned in to like what's going on. They're going to conferences, they're paying attention, and they have the technical know-how to sort of separate some of the wheat from the chaff and things like on this. And so I found them to be a wonderful resource. Like on this too, and it also helps bridge like my social science side, right, with the technology and engineering side.
So we probably have like 30 seconds left. You mentioned that you could touch on curriculum too and how that could be adaptable. Do you want to just say a quick word on that?
Yeah, I'll just say it's a challenge because we think in semesters, years, right? And maybe even like people not wanting to update classes like year over year. And that's just not possible in this space. And so I think one of the things that we need to learn in on-campus teaching that comes in some from online, right, is an update schedule that's not like I have to redo the whole class, right? But thinking about when there are changes that are meaningful, right, how to efficiently increment the parts of a module, right? Like to a class. And I think some tools and hands-on learning and sort of the digitization of some of the things and experiences that students can do. I think this overlaps with data science in the sense that if you can build some of these things yourself, you can update them yourself, right? And you don't have to sort of redo everything in order to keep it like up to date. So this is something we're actively working on at the University of Pittsburgh is how to be more agile in the updating curriculum, like in this space. And so since I probably used all 30 seconds already, I'll say like another discussion maybe or like later.
Yeah, well, and that's great to hear that the university is really supporting faculty in making those changes and making them thoughtfully. So I appreciate that. We are out of time. I think we could have talked for another half hour on this topic. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. Thank you to the audience, and yeah, really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and your experiences at the University of Pittsburgh.
Thank you so much. I
Take
really
care.
appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everyone for being here.
Bye bye.